In 1990, 7-year-old Eli Harper disappeared while waiting for the school bus in Millfield, Maine, but every witness remembered it differently, and none of their stories made sense. No body, no answers anyone could trust. Just an empty corner and 33 years of unanswered questions. But in 2023, a journalist found his jacket on a Scarecrow, perfectly preserved, with a lollipop in the pocket from a company that went out of business 3 years before Eli disappeared. What she discovered next didn't just reopen a cold case. It revealed that in Millfield, some buses never stop running, some passengers never get off, and some hungers are older than the town itself. Hit subscribe for more strange disappearances, haunted cold cases, and reality-bending investigations. Because every case starts with what's missing and ends with what was never supposed to be found. Donna Tremblay had been a freelance journalist for 15 years, long enough to know the difference between a real story and the kind of fluff that paid the bills. What she found in George Bouchard's corn maze on October 15, 2023, was definitely not fluff. She'd driven up to Millfield for country living, one of those authentic New England Halloween traditions, pieces that suburban moms loved to read while drinking their pumpkin spice lattes. 1,500 words, decent pay, and she could probably bang it out in her sleep. The kind of assignment she'd been taking since Danny's overdose, when covering real news started feeling like poking at wounds that wouldn't heal. The corn maze at Bouchard's farm was your standard October tourist trap. Families with sticky-fingered kids, teenagers on dates, retirees with nothing better to do on a Tuesday afternoon. Donna had been wandering through it for 20 minutes, taking the occasional photo, when she realized she was completely turned around. That's when she spotted the Scarecrow. It stood at the intersection of two pathways, arms spread wide like it was directing traffic. Someone had put real effort into this one. It wasn't just old clothes stuffed with straw. The positioning was deliberate, almost artistic. The flannel shirt was weathered but not rotted. The jeans had honest-to-God grass stains on the knees. But the jacket made her stop walking altogether. It was a child's windbreaker, royal blue with reflective strips running down the arms and across the back. The kind every kid in New England wore to school in the late 80s and early 90s, when parents still believed that making your child visible would somehow keep them safe. The jacket should have been falling apart after 30-plus years of Maine weather. Instead, it looked like it had just come off the rack at Sears. Donna moved closer, her photographer's eye cataloging details. Sized large kids. Windbreaker brand. The zipper still had its shine, and the reflective strips hadn't cracked or peeled. Even the cuffs looked crisp. There was something in the breast pocket, a small bulge that made the jacket hang wrong. Before she could talk herself out of it, Donna reached in and pulled out a lollipop. The world seemed to tilt slightly off its axis. Flavor Burst Cherry. Still in its cellophane wrapper, the little cartoon sun mascot grinning up at her like an old friend. The candy inside was crystal clear, no cloudiness or age spots. The white plastic stick was perfectly straight. The problem was, Flavor Burst had gone out of business in 1987. Donna knew because Danny had been obsessed with them as a kid, had hoarded them in a shoebox under his bed until the company folded, and he'd ceremoniously eaten his last one while she watched. The lollipop was warm in her palm. Not room temperature warm, body temperature warm, like some kid had just pulled it from his pocket. Donna's hands started to shake. She looked around the maze, half expecting to find someone watching her reaction to what had to be an elaborate joke. But there were only the rustling corn stalks and the distant sound of a John Deere tractor somewhere beyond the farm's borders. She photographed everything. The jacket from every angle, close-ups of the label and the reflective strips, even the way it hung on the Scarecrow's frame. Her journalism training kicked in even as her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. When she was done, she slipped the lollipop into her own pocket. Felt like stealing, but she needed proof of what she'd found. Evidence of something that shouldn't exist. The path out of the maze led back to the farm stand, where George Bouchard was waiting by the entrance, checking his watch. He was 70-something with the kind of weathered face you got from working the same piece of land for decades. When he saw her emerge from the maze, something shifted in his expression, like he'd been expecting this conversation. "Find everything you needed for your story?" he asked. There was something in his tone that made the hair on Donna's neck stand up. Like he already knew what she'd found in there. "Tell me about that Scarecrow," she said. "The one wearing the blue jacket." Bouchard's face went blank so fast it was like watching someone pull down a window shade. "Got a lot of scarecrows around here." "Which one you mean?" "Bullshit." Donna had been interviewing people long enough to know when someone was lying, and George Bouchard was lying through his teeth. "The windbreaker jacket," she pressed. "Sized large kids. How long has it been out there?" "Change the clothes on those things all the time," Bouchard said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Keeps them looking fresh. You know how it is." No, she didn't know how it was. Because nobody put a perfectly preserved 30-year-old jacket on a scarecrow and expected it to stay that way. "Where did you get it?" "Can't rightly remember. Wife handles most of that stuff." He was already turning away, clearly done with the conversation. "Hope you got what you needed for your article." Donna thanked him and walked back to her rental car. But she wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. Because whatever was happening in that corn maze was bigger than some farmer's Halloween decorations. And she had a feeling she'd only just scratched the surface. Beth Harper knew exactly how many October 12 THS she'd lived through since Eli disappeared. 33. She could tell you without checking her calendar, without counting on her fingers, because each one was burned into her memory like a brand. This morning was number 34, and Phil had finally said what they'd both been thinking for years. "I can't do this anymore, Beth." He'd said it over breakfast, his voice careful and quiet, the way people talked when they'd already made their peace with hurting someone. He was dressed for work. The Prudential office downtown where he spent his days calculating other people's disasters, and his tie was knotted just so, which somehow made everything worse. Phil always took extra care with his appearance when he was about to break someone's heart. "You don't understand," Beth said, not looking up from her Cheerios. The words came out automatically, worn smooth from 33 years of repetition. "Today's different." "Today is October 12th, Phil replied. "Same as it was last year. Same as it'll be next year if you don't get help." But Phil was wrong. Today was different because today was the day Eli would wave at her from the back window of the 751 bus, just like he had every October 12th since 2008. The first time had been her 21st birthday, 15 years after he'd vanished, and she'd been hung over and squinting against the morning light when she'd seen him there, small hand pressed against the glass, that gap-toothed smile she remembered from when they were kids. Now she stood at the corner of Maple and Pine, checking her watch. 7:46. For minutes early, just like always. The street was empty except for Mrs. Thibodeau walking her ancient beagle and the sound of someone starting their car a few blocks over. Normal October sounds. The kind of sounds that had been the soundtrack to her vigil for more than 3 decades. Beth had been 3 when Eli disappeared. Old enough to remember him teaching her to tie her shoes, patient with her fumbling fingers. Old enough to remember how he always saved the marshmallows from his Lucky Charms for her. Old enough to remember waiting at this exact corner that first morning when he didn't come home from school, watching their mother pace the sidewalk like a caged animal until Dad finally carried her inside. She'd inherited that waiting the way other people inherited blue eyes or bad knees. It had become as natural as breathing, as necessary as sleep. Even when she'd gone away to Umaine, 2 hours south in Orono, she'd driven back every October 12th to stand on this corner. Even during her honeymoon in Bermuda, she'd woken at 7:47 and spent 4 minutes staring out at the Atlantic, calculating time zones, imagining this empty street corner in Millfield. The first time she'd actually seen Eli had been 2008. She'd been 21, fresh out of college with a hangover that felt like someone driving nails through her skull. She'd almost skipped the vigil that year, almost convinced herself that maybe it was time to let go, time to move on like everyone kept telling her to do. Then the bus had appeared. It wasn't like the regular school buses that ran the route now, all shiny and yellow with GPS tracking and safety cameras. This one was older. The paint faded and the sides dented from years of rural Maine winters. Through the rear window, she'd seen a small boy with brown hair and serious eyes, wearing a blue jacket with reflective strips. He'd pressed his palm against the glass when he saw her, had smiled that crooked smile she remembered from 1,000 breakfast tables, and had waved. Beth had run after the bus for 3 blocks before it disappeared into the morning traffic, becoming just another vehicle in a line of vehicles that shouldn't have included a bus from 1990. That had been the beginning of her real faith. Phil had tried to understand in the early days of their relationship. He'd even stood with her a few times during their courtship, holding her hand while she explained about Eli, about the bus, about the promise she'd made to always be here when her brother came back. But understanding and accepting weren't the same thing, and somewhere around year 5 of their marriage, his concern had curdled into something uglier. "He's dead, Beth," Phil had said last night, the words hanging between them like a curse. "Eli's been dead for 33 years. You know that, don't you? Somewhere in that broken place you keep locked up, you have to know that." But Phil was wrong about that too. Dead children didn't wave from phantom buses. Dead children didn't age slowly in whatever place existed beyond the normal world. Dead children didn't keep their promises to always say goodbye. 7:50. Beth straightened her shoulders and focused on the empty street. In the distance, she could hear it. The rumble of an old diesel engine. The squeak of brakes that needed replacing. The sound of something approaching that existed just outside everyone else's ability to see it. The bus materialized at exactly 7:51. Sliding into view like a photograph developing in slow motion. Same faded yellow paint, same rust spots above the wheel wells, same cracked windshield that had been cracked since 1990. The driver was just a shadow behind the wheel, but Eli was clear as daylight in the back window. He was older now, maybe 14 or 15, but still unmistakably her brother. His face had lengthened and his shoulders had filled out, but his eyes held the same gentle seriousness she remembered. He was wearing the blue jacket, and when he saw her, he pressed both palms against the glass and grinned. Beth raised her hand and waved back, tears streaming down her face, her heart breaking and healing at the same time the way it had for 15 years running. For exactly 4 seconds. She timed it with a stopwatch more than once. She and her brother existed in the same world again. Then the bus faded back into wherever buses like that went, and Beth was alone on the corner with her shadow and the distant sound of Mrs. Thibodeau calling for her beagle to hurry up and finish his business. She walked home to find Phil loading suitcases into his Honda Civic. He looked up when she approached, his face full of the kind of pity that felt like a slap. "Did you see him?" Phil asked. "Yes," Beth said. Phil nodded and slammed the trunk shut. "I'll send for the rest of my stuff next week." Beth watched her husband of 8 years drive away, then went inside to mark another small blue star on her kitchen calendar. Tomorrow was October 13th. Another day to get through. 364 days until she could see her brother again. She'd waited this long. She could wait a little longer. The Pine Ridge Care Center smelled like Lysol and lost hope, and Frank Duloc was in the activities room working on a jigsaw puzzle that he'd been trying to finish for 3 weeks. It was a picture of a covered bridge in Vermont, one of those Thomas Kincaid deals with about 10,000 pieces, and Frank kept putting the same wrong piece in the same wrong spot over and over again like his brain was stuck in a loop. Donna found him hunched over the table, his spotted hands shaking as he tried to force a piece of sky into what was obviously part of a tree. He was 84 according to his file, but looked older in that particular way that happened when a person carried more weight than their shoulders were designed to handle. "Mr. Duloc?" Donna pulled up a chair beside him. "I'm Donna Tremblay. I'm a journalist. I was hoping we could talk about the time you drove school buses." Frank's hands went still over the puzzle pieces. When he looked up at her, his eyes were watery and distant, like he was looking at her through layers of fog. "Buses," he said, testing the word like he wasn't sure it belonged in his mouth anymore. "I drove the Route 7 for 31 years. Good job. Good kids, mostly." Donna had interviewed enough elderly people to know you had to be patient, let them find their way to the memories at their own speed. "Do you remember October 12th, 1990? Something shifted in Frank's face. A tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible flinch. His hands started shaking worse. "Eli Harper," he said without hesitation. 7 years old. Little brown-haired kid with the gap between his front teeth. Always sat 3 seats back on the left side. Always had his lunchbox with him. Good kid. Real polite. "What happened that morning?" Frank picked up a puzzle piece, part of the bridge's wooden railing, and turned it over and over in his fingers like a worry stone. He was there at the bus stop, corner of Maple and Pine, same as every school day for 2 months. Had his backpack, had that blue jacket with the shiny strips his mother bought him. It was cold that morning. October in Maine, you know how it bites. Donna waited. In her experience, old people either told you everything at once or gave it to you in pieces, and Frank seemed to be the piece-by-piece type. I opened the door, Frank continued, his voice getting quieter. Same as always. Kids climbed on, Tommy Bouchard first, then the Levesque girl, then little Billy Cormier with his Boston Red Sox cap. But Eli... Frank stopped talking and stared at the puzzle piece in his hands. Did he get on the bus? See, that's the thing. Frank looked directly at Donna for the first time, and his eyes held a clarity that was almost unsettling. He did and he didn't. I don't understand. Neither do I, and I've had 33 years to think about it. Frank set down the puzzle piece and leaned back in his chair. I remember clear as day. Eli climbed up those 3 steps, said morning, Mr. Duloc, polite as you please, walked down the aisle to his regular seat. I watched him in my rearview mirror, same as I always did. Made sure all the kids were settled before I put the bus in gear. Frank paused, his breathing shallow and quick. But when we got to school, when all the other kids were getting off, Eli's seat was empty, like he'd never been there at all. Maybe he got off at an earlier stop? Frank shook his head vigorously. No stops between Maple Street and Pine Ridge Elementary. I know that route better than I know my own name. Drove it every weekday for 31 years, rain or shine. He reached for another puzzle piece, this one a fragment of blue sky, and Donna noticed his hands had stopped shaking. The police didn't believe me, Frank said. Said maybe I was confused, maybe the boy never got on the bus in the first place. But I wasn't confused. I saw him clear as I see you sitting there right now. Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Problem is, I also saw that empty seat when we got to school. Both things happened. Both things are true, even though they can't be. Mr. Duloc. Frank. After 33 years of carrying this around, I think we can use first names. He abandoned the puzzle entirely and fixed Donna with a stare that made her uncomfortable. You found something, didn't you? That's why you're here. Donna thought about the lollipop wrapped in tissue paper back in her hotel room. What makes you think that? Because every October for 33 years, I dream about that bus ride. And in my dreams, Eli's sitting in his usual seat wearing that blue jacket. Only in the dreams, when we get to school, the jacket's still there even though Eli's gone. Just the jacket, sitting upright like there's still a boy in it. The hair on Donna's arms stood up. In the dreams, I always try to go back and get the jacket, but the bus won't start. And I can hear Eli somewhere I can't see, calling my name, asking why I left him behind. Frank reached across the table and took Donna's hand. His fingers were cold and papery, but his grip was surprisingly strong. You found the jacket, didn't you? After all these years, someone finally found it. Donna nodded slowly. On a Scarecrow, at Bouchard's farm. George's place. Frank smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. Makes sense. The Bouchards have been in Millfield longer than anybody. They know things the rest of us have forgotten. What kind of things? Frank released her hand and went back to his puzzle, but his movements were more agitated now, trying to force pieces together that obviously didn't belong. The thing about memory, he said, is that it's not like a videotape. It's alive. It changes, it grows, it tells you things you never knew you knew. He held up a puzzle piece that was clearly part of a tree but kept trying to fit it into the bridge. Sometimes I remember Eli getting on the bus clear as day. Other times, I remember him standing at the bus stop, waving goodbye as we drove past without stopping. Both memories feel real. Both memories feel true. Which one actually happened? Frank was quiet for so long that Donna began to wonder if he'd forgotten the question. Then, without looking up from his puzzle, he said, I think something took him between the bus stop and his seat. Something that lives in the space between 1 second and the next. and I think it's been trying to give him back ever since. He looked at Donna with eyes that held depths she hadn't expected from an old man with dementia. There was a lollipop in the jacket pocket, wasn't there? Flavor burst cherry. Still in the wrapper. Donna's mouth went dry. How did you know that? Because Eli always had one in his jacket pocket. Always saved it for after lunch. Like dessert. Frank smiled again, and this time there was something like relief in his expression. Company went out of business 3 years before he disappeared. Funny thing about time, isn't it? Sometimes it doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows of Pine Ridge Care Center, and Donna thought about impossible lollipops and phantom buses and the weight of carrying truths that nobody else would believe. The question isn't where Eli went, Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. The question is, why is he trying so hard to come back? Tommy Bouchard owned a used car lot on Route 2, the kind of place where every vehicle came with a story and most of those stories involved someone's bad luck. When Donna found him there on a gray October afternoon, he was under the hood of a 2015 Subaru Forester, cursing at a radiator hose that had seen better days. Tommy Bouchard? She called out. He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag that had probably been white sometime during the Clinton administration. Tommy was 40 now, but Donna could still see the 8-year-old boy he'd been in 1990. Same round face, same cowlick that refused to stay down no matter how much hair gel he used. Yeah, that's me. You looking to buy or just browse? Neither. I'm a journalist. I wanted to ask you about October 12, 1990. The change in Tommy's expression was immediate and dramatic. The easy car salesman's smile vanished, replaced by something that looked like he'd just bitten into something rotten. Jesus Christ, he muttered. Not this again. You were on Frank Dulock's bus that morning. The morning Eli Harper disappeared. Tommy tossed the rag onto his workbench harder than necessary. Look, lady. I already told the cops everything I knew back then. Kid got on the bus. Kid didn't get off the bus. End of story. But that's just it, Donna said. Other people remember it differently. Other people can kiss my ass. Tommy started walking toward the office trailer that served as his dealership's headquarters, clearly hoping she'd take the hint and leave. I was 8 years old. You want to know what I remember? I remember being scared shitless because some kid just vanished into thin air and nobody could explain how. Donna followed him. So Eli did get on the bus? Tommy stopped walking and turned around. Yeah, he got on the bus. Sat in his usual spot, 3 seats back on the left. Same place he sat every day since school started. And then nothing. We drove to school. Kids got off. Eli wasn't there anymore. Tommy's voice was getting louder, attracting the attention of a couple browsing a Chevy Silverado near the road. Look, I've spent 33 years trying to forget that morning, and I'm not about to dig it all up again for some reporter looking for a Halloween story. But Donna had been doing this long enough to recognize when someone was protesting too much. Tommy wasn't just reluctant to talk. He was scared. What aren't you telling me? Tommy glanced around the lot, making sure nobody else was listening, then grabbed Donna's arm and pulled her toward the office trailer. You want to know what I remember? He said once they were inside, his voice dropping to a whisper. I remember Eli getting on the bus that morning, clear as day. But I also remember him not getting on. Both things happened. Okay? Both things are true, and if that makes me crazy, then I've been crazy for 33 years. He slumped into the chair behind his desk, suddenly looking every one of his 40 years. There's more, he said. After we got to school, after the cops came and asked us all those questions, I kept seeing him. Eli. In the hallways, in the cafeteria, on the playground. Always just out of the corner of my eye, always wearing that blue jacket. But when I'd turn to look, he'd be gone. Tommy opened his desk drawer and pulled out a pint bottle of Jack Daniels, unscrewed the cap, and took a long pull. Still see him sometimes, he admitted. Especially in October. Especially around the 12th. He's older now, like he's been growing up somewhere else. But it's still him. Donna thought about Beth Harper, standing on a corner every October 12th for 33 years, waving at a phantom bus. Have you ever talked to anyone else about this? Other kids who were on the bus that day. You mean Janet? Yeah, I talked to Janet. Tommy took another drink and screwed the cap back on. Janet Levesque. Lives over in Brunswick now. Married, name's Thibodeau. She says Eli never got on the bus that morning. Says she was sitting right behind him and would have noticed if he'd climbed those steps. But you remember him getting on. Clear as I remember my own name. Tommy leaned back in his chair, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles. So either Janet's lying, or I'm crazy, or something happened that morning that doesn't fit into the normal way the world's supposed to work. He looked at Donna with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone who sold used cars for a living. You found something, didn't you? That's why you're here asking questions after all these years. Donna nodded. A jacket. Blue windbreaker sized large kids. On a Scarecrow at George Bouchard's farm. Tommy wasn't surprised. If anything, he looked relieved. Makes sense it'd be at George's place, he said. The Bouchards have been in Millfield since before the town had a name. George's great-grandfather used to tell stories about things that happened in these woods. Things that didn't make sense to regular folks. What kind of things? Kids disappearing. Always in October, always around the same time. Goes back more than 100 years, according to the old stories. Most people figured it was just local folklore. Scary stories to tell around a campfire. Tommy stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his lot full of cars that had all seen better days. But after what happened to Eli, I started paying attention to those stories. Started looking through old newspaper archives at the library. You know what I found? Donna waited. Every 20 years or so, going back to the 1800s, a child disappears in Millfield around October 12th. Always between the ages of 6 and 8. Always last seen waiting for something, a wagon, a carriage, later on a school bus. And they're always found later, or pieces of them are, wearing clothes that should have rotted away decades ago. Tommy turned back to Donna, his face pale. I think something lives in these woods. Something old. Something hungry. And I think every generation it takes one of us. He paused, staring at his hands. The question I've been asking myself for 33 years is, why did it give Eli back? Outside, a car door slammed and Tommy's demeanor immediately shifted back to used car salesman mode. But as Donna headed for the door, he called out to her. You talked to Janet yet? Not yet. When you do, Tommy said, ask her about the dreams. Ask her if she's been having the dreams where Eli's still on the bus. Still sitting in his seat. But he's older now. Ask her if she's been waking up in cold sweats every October for the past 33 years. Tommy's smile was anything but reassuring. Because if she says no, then she's been lying about more than just what she saw that morning. Janet Thibodeau lived in a split-level ranch in Brunswick that looked like every other house on Birch Street. Beige vinyl siding, two-car garage, the kind of place where nothing interesting was supposed to happen. When Donna knocked on her door at 3 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, she could hear kids screaming somewhere in the backyard and the sound of a television turned up too loud. The woman who answered the door was 41, according to Donna's notes, but looked older. Janet had the tired eyes of someone who'd been running on fumes for years, and her brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days. She was wearing scrubs, the kind nurses wore, and there was a coffee stain on her sleeve that looked like it had been there since morning. Janet Thibodeau? I'm Donna Tremblay. I'm a journalist. I was hoping we could talk about something that happened when you were a kid. Janet's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. What kind of something? October 12, 1990. You were on the school bus that morning when Eli Harper disappeared. The color drained from Janet's face so fast that Donna thought she might faint. She gripped the door frame with one hand and looked over Donna's shoulder like she was checking to see if anyone else was watching. I can't talk about that, Janet said quietly. I told the police everything I knew back then. Kid never got on the bus. That's all I remember. But her voice was shaking, and Donna had been doing this long enough to know when someone was lying. Can I come in? Just for a few minutes. Janet hesitated, then stepped aside. The house smelled like macaroni and cheese and pine sol, and there were toys scattered across the living room floor like the aftermath of a small war. Janet led her to the kitchen and poured herself a cup of coffee from a Mr. Coffee machine that looked like it belonged in a museum. "You want some?" Janet asked, already pouring a second cup without waiting for an answer. Her hands were shaking so badly that coffee sloshed onto the counter. "Tommy Bouchard says you remember it differently than he does," Donna said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "He says Eli got on the bus that morning." "Tommy Bouchard's been drinking too much for 20 years, Janet replied, but there was no conviction in her voice. "Half the time he doesn't know what day it is." "What do you remember?" Janet sat down across from her and wrapped both hands around her coffee mug like she was trying to warm herself up. "I remember a little boy who never made it to school. I remember his mother crying at the bus stop the next morning, asking us if we'd seen him. I remember feeling sorry for her. She took a sip of coffee and winced, like it was too hot or too bitter. But mostly I remember wanting to forget about the whole thing. Some stories are better left buried." Donna pulled out her phone and showed Janet the photo she'd taken in the corn maze. "Does this look familiar?" Janet glanced at the screen and immediately looked away, but not before Donna saw her face go white again. "I don't know what that is." "It's a blue windbreaker jacket sized large kids. Same kind Eli was wearing that morning. I found it on a Scarecrow at George Bouchard's farm, and it looks like it was put there yesterday instead of 33 years ago." Janet stood up so fast that her chair scraped against the linoleum. "I think you should leave." "There was a lollipop in the pocket," Donna continued. "Flavor burst cherry. Still in the wrapper. Company went out of business in 1987. Janet froze with her back to Donna, one hand gripping the edge of the sink. "That's impossible," she whispered. "That's what I thought too. But I've got the lollipop in my hotel room, and I've got photos of the jacket. Both things exist, even though they shouldn't." Donna stood up and moved closer. "What really happened that morning, Janet?" For a long moment, the only sound was the distant noise of kids playing and the hum of the refrigerator. Then Janet turned around, and there were tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand," she said. "I've spent 33 years trying to convince myself that what I saw wasn't real, that it was just a kid's imagination or trauma, or whatever the therapists wanted to call it." "What did you see?" Janet walked back to the table and sat down heavily, like all the air had gone out of her. "Eli got on the bus that morning," she said. "Sat in his usual seat, 3 rows back on the left. I was sitting right behind him, same as always. We didn't talk much. Eli was quiet, kept to himself mostly. But he was there." She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "About halfway to school, I looked up from my book and—" Janet paused, struggling with the words. "He was still sitting there, but he was different. Older, like he'd aged 5 years in 5 minutes. His hair was longer, his shoulders were broader, but he was still wearing the same blue jacket." Donna felt the hair on her arms stand up. "I blinked, and he was 7 again. Then I blinked again and he was older. It kept happening, back and forth, like he couldn't decide which age he was supposed to be." Janet reached for her coffee with shaking hands. "When we got to school, his seat was empty, but I swear I could still see him sometimes, out of the corner of my eye. Different ages all at the same time, like he was stuck somehow, cycling through all the years he should have lived." She looked at Donna with eyes that held 33 years of doubt. "I told the police that Eli never got on the bus because I knew they wouldn't believe what I really saw. Hell, I didn't believe it myself. Still don't most days. But you dream about it." It wasn't a question, and Janet nodded miserably. "Every October, same dream over and over. I'm sitting on the bus, and Eli's in front of me, and he keeps changing ages. Sometimes he's 7, sometimes he's 15, sometimes he's older than I am now. And he always turns around and looks at me with these sad eyes, like he's asking for help but doesn't know how to ask." Janet stood up and walked to the window, looking out at her backyard where her own kids were playing on a swing set. "In the dreams, he always has that lollipop. Takes it out of his pocket, unwraps it but never eats it. Just holds it like it's the most important thing in the world." She turned back to Donna. "The weird thing is, in the dreams, the lollipop is always perfect. Never gets old, never gets sticky. Like time stopped working for that piece of candy. Donna thought about the impossible warmth of the lollipop in her palm, how it had felt like it had just come from a child's pocket. Janet, what if the dreams aren't just dreams? What do you mean? What if Eli really is stuck somewhere, cycling through the ages he should have lived? What if that lollipop is proof that time works differently for him? Janet laughed, but there was no humor in it. Then that would mean I've been lying to myself for 33 years. That would mean the thing I saw on the bus that morning was real, and I've been calling myself crazy all this time for nothing. She sat back down at the table and buried her face in her hands. Do you know what it's like? Living with a memory that makes no sense? Knowing you saw something impossible, but not being able to trust your own eyes. Donna thought about Frank Duloc and his contradictory memories, about Tommy Bouchard seeing Eli in the corners of his vision, about Beth Harper waiting at a bus stop for 33 years. I'm starting to understand, she said. The question is, what do we do about it? Janet looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. We find out what that lollipop really is, she said. Because if it's what I think it is, then Eli Harper has been trying to tell us something for 33 years. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows of Janet's house, and somewhere in the distance, Donna could have sworn she heard the sound of air brakes and the rumble of an old diesel engine. But when she looked out the window, the street was empty. The Millfield Public Library sat on Main Street like a brick monument to better times, back when small towns still believed that books could save them from whatever darkness lived in the woods. Donna found what she was looking for in the basement archives. Musty boxes of old newspapers that nobody had bothered to digitize, probably because nobody thought anyone would ever want to read about long-dead scandals and forgotten tragedies. But Donna wasn't looking for scandals. She was looking for a pattern. She'd been at it for 6 hours, working her way backwards through decades of the Millfield Gazette, when she found the first one. October 15, 1970. Local boy still missing. Millfield police continue to search for 8-year-old Michael Cormier, who disappeared while waiting for the morning school bus on October 12. The boy was last seen at the corner of Maple and Pine wearing a brown corduroy jacket and carrying his school lunch. Bus driver Harold Thibodeau reported that the child never boarded the vehicle. Donna's hands went still on the yellowed newsprint. Same corner, same age, same story, just different names. She kept digging. October 18, 1951. Search called off for missing girl. Millfield, after 1 week of intensive searching, authorities have called off the hunt for 7-year-old Susan Bouchard, who vanished while waiting for transportation to the one-room schoolhouse on Mill Road. The girl was last seen wearing a blue wool coat that her grandmother had sewn for her. October 20, 1932. Farm boy disappears. Millfield young Timothy Duloc, age 6, failed to arrive at school on October 12 after setting out on foot from his family's farm on the Old County Road. The boy was wearing his father's cut-down work jacket and was carrying a tin lunch pail. Donna felt sick. The names were familiar: Cormier, Bouchard, Duloc. The same families that still lived in Millfield, whose children had been on the bus with Eli Harper in 1990. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of the newspaper articles, her hands shaking as the pattern became undeniable. Every 20 years, give or take. Always a child between 6 and 8. Always October 12th. Always wearing some kind of jacket or coat. And always the same detail buried in the follow-up stories. Weeks or months later, pieces of clothing would be found in impossible locations, perfectly preserved despite exposure to the elements. November 30th, 1932. Boy's jacket found. Millfield. A jacket belonging to missing boy Timothy Duloc was discovered yesterday by hunters in a tree near Bouchard's farm. Despite being exposed to 6 weeks of rain and early snow, the garment appeared to be in the same condition as when the boy disappeared. December 3, 1951. Missing girl's coat located. Millfield. The blue wool coat worn by Susan Bouchard on the day of her disappearance has been found hanging on a fence post near the old logging road. The coat shows no signs of weathering and appears to have been recently cleaned. January 8, 1971. Search evidence recovered. Millfield. Michael Cormier's brown corduroy jacket was discovered by a local farmer while clearing snow from his fields. The jacket was found draped over a scarecrow and appeared to be in perfect condition, leading police to theorize that it may have been recently placed there. Donna sat back in her chair, staring at the photographs on her phone. Every 20 years. Perfect preservation. Always found on or near Bouchard property. The Bouchards. George's family had been in Millfield since before the town had a name, according to Tommy. They knew things the rest of the town had forgotten. She pulled out more boxes going further back. The newspapers got sparser as she went deeper into the 19th century. But the pattern held. 1913, 1891, 1872. Children disappearing in October, their clothes found months later in impossible condition. But it was the oldest article she found that made her blood turn to ice water. October 15, 1854. Tragedy strikes local family. Millfield Township. The community mourns the loss of young Jean-Baptiste Bouchard, age 7, who disappeared while walking to the village school on October 12. The boy was last seen wearing his Sunday coat near the stand of ancient oak trees where his grandfather, Claude Bouchard, had planned to build the family's new barn. The boy's father, Henri Bouchard, has offered a substantial reward for any information regarding his son's whereabouts. Of particular note is a peculiar lollipop the boy was known to carry. A hard candy imported from France that the family had received as a gift from relatives in Quebec. Donna's mouth went dry. A lollipop. In 1854. She read the follow-up story, dated 6 weeks later. November 28, 1854. Strange discovery at Bouchard Farm. Millfield Township. Henri Bouchard made a disturbing discovery while clearing timber from his property yesterday. His missing son's coat was found hanging from a scarecrow that Bouchard swears he did not erect. More puzzling still, the boy's French lollipop was found in the coat pocket, appearing as fresh as the day it was purchased. In a statement to this reporter, the elder Bouchard claimed that his family has been cursed by something that lives in the old places, and that his ancestors in Quebec had warned him about building on land that belongs to older things than us. The farmer has announced his intention to abandon his property and return to Canada with his remaining family. However, local records show that Henri Bouchard never left Millfield. His descendants continue to farm the same land to this day. Donna sat in the basement of the library as the late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows and tried to process what she'd discovered. The disappearances went back at least 200 years. Always the same family names: Bouchard, Duloc, Cormier, Levesque, Thibodeau. The founding families of Millfield, bound together by something older than the town itself. And always the clothes were found on Bouchard land. Always perfectly preserved. Always arranged on scarecrows that appeared overnight. She thought about George Bouchard's reaction when she'd asked about the jacket. The way his face had gone blank. The careful way he'd avoided her eyes. He'd known exactly what she was talking about, because his family had been finding those clothes for 2 centuries. Donna gathered up the newspapers and headed for the door, her mind racing. The Bouchards weren't just random witnesses to these disappearances. They were part of the pattern. Maybe even the center of it. She needed to talk to George again. But this time she was going armed with 200 years of history. And she had a feeling that whatever had taken Jean-Baptiste Bouchard in 1854 was the same thing that had taken Eli Harper in 1990. The same thing that was still hungry, still waiting, still marking time in 20-year cycles. As she walked to her car, Donna noticed that the October sun was setting earlier than it should have been. The shadows were longer, darker, and they seemed to point toward the road that led out to Bouchard's farm. Somewhere in those shadows, something was counting down to the next October 12th. And Donna had a horrible feeling that this time, it wouldn't be satisfied with just taking one child. Beth Harper hadn't slept in 4 days. She knew this because she'd been counting. Not hours, not minutes, but heartbeats. Her pulse had become a metronome marking time until October 12th, and every beat reminded her that Phil was gone. That her job at the bank was probably gone too. She'd stopped showing up on Tuesday, and that none of it mattered because in 6 days, she would see Eli again. Only this year felt different. This year, she'd started seeing the bus during the day. It happened first on Thursday afternoon while she was standing in line at Shaw's, buying groceries she didn't really need. Through the store's front windows, she'd seen it roll past. The same faded yellow bus with the cracked windshield, the same rust spots above the wheel wells. And there, in the rear window, had been Eli. Older now, maybe 16 or 17, but still wearing that blue jacket. He'd pressed his palm against the glass and mouthed something she couldn't understand. Beth had dropped her basket and run outside, but the parking lot was empty except for a few scattered cars and a woman loading groceries into a Honda CR-V. "Did you see the bus?" Beth had asked the woman, grabbing her arm. The woman had looked at her like she was insane. "What bus, honey?" That had been Thursday. By Friday, she was seeing the bus 3 or 4 times a day. Always just glimpses. Turning a corner, reflected in a store window, disappearing behind a building. And Eli was always there, always trying to tell her something, always just out of reach. By Saturday, Beth had stopped leaving her house. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at the calendar on the wall. October 12th was circled in red marker, the way it had been every year since she'd started this vigil. But this year, she'd also marked October 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th with small blue stars, because those were the days she'd seen the bus. The pattern was accelerating. Her phone had been ringing all morning, her supervisor at the bank, probably, or maybe one of the few friends she had left. But Beth couldn't answer it because answering meant explaining, and explaining meant admitting that maybe Phil had been right all along. Maybe she was losing her mind. The doorbell rang at 2 o'clock, and Beth ignored it. Then it rang again, followed by knocking. Persistent knocking that didn't sound like it was going to stop. "Mrs. Harper?" A woman's voice called through the door. "My name is Donna Tremblay. I'm a journalist. I think we need to talk about your brother." Beth's head snapped up from the table. Nobody talked about Eli. Nobody except her, and only to herself, and only in whispers. She walked to the front door but didn't open it. "Go away. I found his jacket," the woman said, "on a Scarecrow at George Bouchard's farm. There was a lollipop in the pocket. Flavor burst cherry." Beth's hands started shaking. She pressed her forehead against the door, feeling the cool wood against her skin. "That's impossible," she whispered. "That's what everyone keeps saying. But I've got photos. I've got evidence. And I think you're the only person in this town who might be able to help me understand what it means." Beth unlocked the door with trembling fingers and opened it just wide enough to see the woman standing on her front porch. Donna Tremblay was younger than Beth had expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of tired eyes that came from asking too many questions and not liking the answers. "Show me," Beth said. Donna pulled out her phone and scrolled through photos. The jacket on the Scarecrow, close-ups of the windbreaker label, the lollipop still in its wrapper. Beth felt something inside her chest crack open. A place she'd kept locked for 33 years. "Where did you get these?" "I took them 3 days ago. But here's the thing. I've been researching the disappearances in this town, and this isn't the first time a child's clothes have been found in perfect condition years after they vanished." Donna showed her more photos, newspaper clippings, old articles, a pattern stretching back 2 centuries. "Every 20 years, Donna continued. "Always October 12th. Always a child between 6 and 8. And always, their clothes turn up months later on Bouchard property, looking like they were just taken off." Beth stared at the photos, her mind racing. "You think someone's been doing this for 200 years? Not someone. Something." The word hung between them like a challenge. Beth looked at Donna's face and saw something she recognized. The expression of someone who'd seen too much to pretend the world made sense anymore. "Come in," Beth said, stepping aside. They sat in Beth's living room, surrounded by the detritus of a life falling apart. Unwashed dishes on the coffee table, mail scattered across the floor, curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. "Tell me about the bus," Donna said. Beth laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Which time? The one I see every October 12th? Or the ones I've been seeing all week?" "All week. It started Thursday. I keep seeing it around town, just glimpses, but it's definitely the same bus." And Eli's always in the back window, trying to tell me something. Beth pulled her knees up to her chest, suddenly feeling very small. I think I'm going crazy. Phil said I was going crazy, and maybe he was right. Maybe I've been standing on that corner for 33 years, waving at nothing, talking to ghosts. What if you haven't been? Donna asked quietly. What if everything you've seen is real? Then that would mean my brother has been trapped somewhere for 33 years, aging slowly, trying to get back to me. And I've been the only one who could see him. Beth looked at Donna with eyes that held too much pain for one person to carry. Do you know what that would make me? Not crazy. Something worse. What? Chosen, Beth whispered. Like I was picked to be his anchor to this world. Like something wanted me to keep watching, keep waiting, keep believing. She stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out at the empty street. But what if I wasn't chosen to help him? What if I was chosen to keep him trapped? The question hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, Beth could have sworn she heard the familiar rumble of diesel brakes. She turned back to Donna, and her face was pale as paper. October 12th is in 5 days, she said. And for the first time in 33 years, I'm scared to go to that corner. Why? Because this year feels different. This year feels like an ending. Beth walked back to the kitchen table and picked up a blue marker, the same one she'd been using to mark her calendar for decades. And I think that whatever's been taking children from this town for 200 years is finally ready to take me too. She circled October 12th again, this time so hard that the marker bled through the paper. The question is, do I let it? George Bouchard was waiting for them in his kitchen when they arrived at the farm just after sunset. He sat at a wooden table that looked like it had been there since the Civil War, drinking coffee from a chipped mug and staring out the window at his corn maze like he was watching for something. Figured you'd be back, he said without looking up when Donna and Beth walked through the screen door, especially with her. He nodded toward Beth, who stood frozen in the doorway like she was afraid to come any further into the house. You know who I am? Beth asked. Course I do. You're Eli Harper's sister. Been standing on that corner every October 12th for 33 years, waiting for a bus that don't officially exist. George finally looked at them, and his eyes held the weight of someone who'd been carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear. Question is, what do you ladies plan to do about it? Donna pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. We want to know the truth. All of it. Truth. George laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Truth is, my family's been finding dead children's clothes for 8 generations. Truth is, we put them on scarecrows because that's what we've always done, and nobody ever told us why. He took a sip of coffee and made a face like it was too bitter. Truth is, something lives in these woods that's older than this town, older than any of the families that settled here. And every 20 years it gets hungry. Beth finally came into the kitchen and sat down beside Donna. What is it? Don't rightly know, George said. My great-great-grandfather called it le mangeur d'enfants, the child eater. French settlers had a name for it before this place was even called Millfield. Knew enough to stay away from the old oak grove where we built the first barn. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening fields. But Henri Bouchard didn't listen. Built his barn right on top of whatever sacred space that thing considered home. And it took his boy as payment. Jean-Baptiste, Donna said. I found the newspaper article. First one, but not the last. Thing made itself clear after that. Every 20 years, it would take a child from one of the founding families. And every time, we'd find their clothes months later, preserved like they'd just come off the rack. George turned back to them, his face grim. We tried leaving town. Every generation, someone tried. But the thing wouldn't let us go. Families that moved away, their children would disappear wherever they went. Always October 12th. Always age 6 to 8. So you stayed, Beth said. We stayed. And we learned to live with it. Fed it our children every 20 years like some kind of terrible tax. Told ourselves it was better than losing everyone. Beth's hands were clenched into fists on the table. You let it take Eli. Wasn't my choice to make, George said quietly. Thing picks who it wants. But this time, he paused, staring at something outside the window. This time it gave him back. What do you mean? Bus that's been running Route 7 since 1990. Same driver, same kids, same route. Every day for 33 years, that bus makes its run with Eli Harper in the back seat, aging one day at a time like he never disappeared. George walked back to the table and sat down heavily. Most folks can't see it, but some can. The other kids from that morning, they catch glimpses. You, he looked at Beth. You see it clear as day every October 12th. Why? Beth whispered. Because something went wrong that morning. Thing was supposed to take Eli clean, body, soul, everything. But it only got part of him. Rest of him got caught between here and wherever that thing lives, trapped on a bus that exists in the space between 1 second and the next. Donna thought about Frank Dulock's contradictory memories, about Eli aging and de-aging on Janet's bus ride. The lollipop, she said. It's from 1854. From the first child who disappeared. George nodded. Thing keeps trophies. Pieces of each child it takes. But Eli's trophy is different. It's still connected to him somehow. Still warm. Still fresh. Like he just put it in his pocket. Outside, the October wind was picking up, rattling the windows and making the old farmhouse creak. In the distance, they could hear something that sounded like the rumble of a diesel engine. It's coming, George said, standing up so fast that his chair fell over backward. Every night since you found that jacket, it's been coming earlier. Through the kitchen window, they could see lights approaching through the corn maze. Not headlights. Something softer, more diffuse, like candlelight filtering through fog. The bus, Beth breathed. It materialized slowly, sliding into view like a photograph developing in real time. The same faded yellow paint, the same rust spots, the same cracked windshield. But this time it wasn't just passing by. It was stopping. The pneumatic door wheezed open, and they could see the shadowy figure of the driver behind the wheel. But it was the back window that made Beth cry out in recognition. Eli was there, pressed against the glass, but he wasn't alone. There were other children with him, dozens of them, faces from different eras, all wearing the clothes they disappeared in. Jean-Baptiste Bouchard in his Sunday coat, Susan Bouchard in her blue wool, Michael Cormier in his brown corduroy, all of them staring out at the farmhouse with eyes that held 2 centuries of waiting. And at the center of them all was Eli, now fully grown but still wearing his blue windbreaker jacket, still holding that impossible lollipop in his hand. He pressed his palm against the glass and mouthed a single word. Help. Jesus Christ, George whispered. They're all still in there. Every child that thing ever took. They're all still trapped on that bus. The engine rumbled louder, and the bus began to move again, sliding back into the darkness between the corn stalks. But as it disappeared, they could hear something new. The sound of children crying, faint and distant, like an echo from a place that shouldn't exist. Beth stood up from the table, her face set with a determination that had been building for 33 years. I know what I have to do, she said. Don't even think about it, Donna said, grabbing her arm. You get on that bus, you'll never come back. Beth looked at her with eyes that held no fear, only resignation. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the only way to free them is to give that thing what it really wants. Which is? Beth smiled, and for the first time in years it looked genuine. Me. It's been waiting for me all along. That's why it only took part of Eli, because it knew I'd spend the rest of my life trying to get him back. She walked toward the door, and George made no move to stop her. Tomorrow is October 12th, she said, and for the first time in 33 years, I'm not going to be standing on that corner waiting. Where will you be? Donna asked. Beth looked back at them one last time. I'll be getting on the bus. October 12th dawned gray and cold, with the kind of mist that made everything look like it was dissolving at the edges. By 7:30 a.m., they were all gathered at the corner of Maple and Pine. Not just Beth, but all of them. Everyone who'd been touched by Eli Harper's disappearance. drawn together by forces none of them fully understood. Frank Duloc was there, sitting in a wheelchair that his grandson had pushed over from Pine Ridge Care Center. The old man's eyes were clearer than they'd been in years, like the approaching confrontation had burned away some of the fog in his mind. "Shouldn't have left him?" Frank kept muttering, his spotted hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. "Shouldn't have driven away without making sure." Tommy Bouchard leaned against his pickup truck, smoking cigarettes and checking his watch every few seconds. He'd brought a pint of Jack Daniels, but it sat unopened in his jacket pocket. Even he wasn't drunk enough to face what was coming. Janet Thibodeau had driven over from Brunswick with her 2 kids sleeping in the back seat of her Honda Civic. She couldn't explain why she'd come. Had just woken up at 6 a.m. with the absolute certainty that she needed to be here. 33 years, she said to no one in particular. 33 years of lying to myself about what I saw. George Bouchard stood apart from the others, his weathered face grim. He'd brought something with him. A canvas bag that he held like it contained something precious or dangerous. And at the center of it all was Beth Harper, standing exactly where she'd stood every October 12th for 33 years. But this time she wasn't alone. This time, the weight of collective memory had brought them all together. Donna stood beside her, still trying to understand how a simple magazine assignment had led her to this moment. In her pocket, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was the impossible lollipop, the thread that had unraveled a 200-year-old tapestry of secrets. "What time is it?" Beth asked, though she knew exactly what time it was. She'd been counting down to 7:51 a.m. for her entire adult life. 7:48, Tommy said, flicking his cigarette into the gutter. 3 minutes. The mist was getting thicker, rolling down Main Street like a living thing. And in that mist, they could all hear it now, the distant rumble of an engine that shouldn't exist, the wheeze of brakes that had been stopping at this corner every day for 33 years. "There," Janet whispered, pointing down the street. The bus materialized slowly, sliding through the fog like a ghost ship emerging from gray water. Same faded yellow paint, same rust spots, same impossible persistence. But this time, as it approached, they could see that it was full. Every seat held a child from a different era. Colonial-era clothing mixed with Victorian dresses, 1950s school clothes beside modern jackets. Decades of missing children, all trapped in the space between one moment and the next, all aging slowly in their prison of time. The bus wheezed to a stop, and the pneumatic door opened with a sigh that sounded like 2 centuries of waiting finally coming to an end. The driver was a shadow behind the wheel, not quite human, not quite anything else. But in the rearview mirror, his eyes burned with something that might have been hunger or satisfaction. "Don't do this," Donna said, grabbing Beth's arm as she stepped toward the bus. "It's what I'm supposed to do," Beth replied. "What I've always been supposed to do. The only question is whether I figured it out in time." She looked back at the others. Frank with his guilty memories, Tommy and Janet with their contradictory truths, George with his family's terrible burden. "All of you saw pieces of what happened that morning," she said. Frank saw Eli get on and not get on. Tommy saw him disappear from his seat. Janet saw him aging and de-aging. All of those things were true, because that thing was already starting to pull him into its world. She took another step toward the bus, and they could see Eli clearly now in the back window. He was 7 years old again, wearing his blue windbreaker jacket, pressing his small palm against the glass. "But it couldn't take him completely," Beth continued, "because I was here, because I was watching. Because some part of that thing's magic requires witnesses, requires someone to remember." George opened his canvas bag and pulled out what looked like a bundle of old clothes. "These are from all the others," he said quietly. "Every jacket, every coat, every piece of clothing we found over the years. My family kept them all." He handed the bundle to Beth. "Figured you might need them." Beth took the clothes, feeling the weight of 2 centuries of loss. Each piece was perfectly preserved, still holding the essence of the child who'd worn it. "You think this will work?" she asked. "Don't know," George admitted. "But my great-grandmother used to say that everything has a price. Maybe the price for taking all those children is giving them back. Beth stepped onto the bus and immediately felt the world shift around her. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and forgotten time. The children in the seats turned to look at her, dozens of faces spanning 2 centuries, all with the same expression of desperate hope. "I know why you're here," she said to the shadow behind the wheel. "You've been waiting for me. You took my brother to make sure I'd come looking for him." The shadow didn't respond, but the bus began to move, pulling away from the corner where Beth had spent 33 years of her life. Through the windows, she could see the others growing smaller in the distance. Donna running after the bus, Frank reaching out with his spotted hands, Tommy and Janet and George all standing together at the corner where everything had started. But Beth wasn't afraid. For the first time in 33 years, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She walked down the aisle between the seats, past all the missing children, carrying the bundle of their clothes like an offering. At the back of the bus, Eli was waiting for her, still 7 years old, still holding his impossible lollipop. "I'm sorry it took me so long," she whispered, kneeling beside his seat. Eli smiled, that gap-toothed grin she remembered from 1,000 breakfast tables, and held out the lollipop. Beth took it, and felt the weight of 2 centuries of stolen time flowing through her fingers. The bus was picking up speed now, heading toward whatever place existed between the moments, between the seconds, between the heartbeats of the normal world. But Beth wasn't alone anymore. She had Eli and she had all the others, and she had the clothes that would remind them who they used to be. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to bring them all home. The bus didn't go to hell. It didn't go to some otherworldly dimension or mystical realm between the living and the dead. It went to the old oak grove behind Bouchard's farm, where Henri Bouchard had built his barn in 1854 and accidentally disturbed something that had been sleeping in the roots of trees older than European settlement. Beth felt the bus shudder to a stop in a clearing she'd never seen before, though she'd lived in Millfield her entire life. Ancient oaks formed a perfect circle around them, their branches interwoven overhead like the ribs of some massive cathedral. In the center of the circle was a barn that looked exactly like the one in the old photographs, as if time had stopped working properly in this place. The shadow driver turned in his seat, and for the first time, Beth could see his face clearly. It wasn't the face of a monster or a demon. It was the face of Jean-Baptiste Bouchard, 7 years old, exactly as he'd looked the day he disappeared in 1854. "Took you long enough," he said, and his voice carried the weight of a century and a half of waiting. "You're the first one," Beth realized. "You're what's been taking them." Jean-Baptiste nodded sadly. "Thing in the grove took me, but it didn't know what to do with me after. I was just a boy, but I had the strongest connection to this place, Bouchard blood, Bouchard land. So I became its hands, its voice, its way of reaching into your world." He gestured to the children filling the bus seats. "Every 20 years it gets hungry, and every 20 years I have to bring it food. But you kept them alive. Couldn't let them go completely. They're all someone's brother, someone's sister, someone's child. I know what it's like to be missed." Beth looked around at the faces staring back at her. Dozens of children spanning 2 centuries, all trapped in the moment they'd been taken, all preserved in the amber of impossible time. "The clothes," she said, holding up George's bundle. "You made sure they'd be found. Had to give the families something. Some proof they existed, some reason to remember." Jean-Baptiste's young face crumpled with guilt. "But I kept the children. Told myself it was mercy, that being trapped was better than being eaten." Beth walked down the aisle, past Susan Bouchard in her blue wool coat, past Michael Cormier in his brown corduroy jacket, past all the others who'd been waiting for someone to find them. She stopped at Eli's seat and knelt beside her brother. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you choose," Jean-Baptiste said. "Take your brother and go. Leave the rest of us here. Thing in the grove will let you. It's got what it really wanted. Which is you, the witness, the one who remembered hardest, who refused to let go. Your faith has been feeding it for 33 years, keeping it strong." Beth felt the truth of it settle into her bones. Her vigils, her rituals, her absolute refusal to accept Eli's death. All of it had been food for something ancient and hungry. Or, she asked, or you give it what it's never had before. A willing sacrifice. Someone who chooses to feed it instead of being taken. Jean-Baptiste stood up from the driver's seat, and Beth could see that he was fading around the edges, becoming translucent. I'm tired, he said simply. Been carrying this for 170 years. If you take my place, if you become its new hands in the world, I can finally rest. And maybe, if you're stronger than I was, you can find a way to starve it instead of feeding it. Outside the bus, something was stirring in the oak grove. The trees were bending inward, their ancient branches reaching toward the vehicle like gnarled fingers. Whatever lived in the roots was waking up, responding to the presence of so much gathered life. Beth felt the bundle of clothes in her arms, each piece holding the memory of a lost child. She thought about George Bouchard and his family's terrible burden, about Frank Duloc and his contradictory memories, about Tommy and Janet and all the others who'd been carrying pieces of this truth for 33 years. There's a third option, she said quietly. Jean-Baptiste tilted his head, curious. What if we don't feed it at all? What if we take away its food source entirely? It'll die, Jean-Baptiste said. But it'll take us with it. All of us. Beth looked at Eli, 7 years old forever, still holding that impossible lollipop. She thought about the life he'd never gotten to live, the man he'd never become, the children he'd never have. Then she thought about all the other lives that could be saved if the cycle ended here. Eli, she said softly, do you understand what's happening? Her brother nodded solemnly. I've been waiting for you to come get me. I can take you home. We can go back to our old life and you can grow up and everything can be normal. But the others? Beth looked around the bus at decades of missing children. The others stay trapped. Eli considered this with the seriousness that only 7-year-olds could bring to impossible decisions. Then he held out his lollipop to Beth. This belongs to him, he said, nodding toward Jean-Baptiste. From when he was little. Maybe if we give it back, he can remember who he used to be instead of what he became. Beth took the lollipop, feeling its impossible warmth, and understood what her brother was trying to tell her. The candy wasn't just a trophy. It was an anchor, keeping Jean-Baptiste connected to his humanity across a century and a half of servitude. She walked to the front of the bus and held out the lollipop to the first missing child of Millfield. Remember, she said simply. Jean-Baptiste took the candy, and immediately his face changed. The weight of 170 years fell away, and he was just a 7-year-old boy again, confused and scared and very, very tired. I want to go home, he whispered. So do all of them, Beth said, gesturing to the children behind her. And maybe if we're brave enough to let go of what we think we want, we can make that happen. She walked back to Eli and knelt beside him one more time. I've spent 33 years trying to bring you back, she said. But maybe what you really need is for me to let you go. Eli smiled and reached up to touch her face with his small hand. I was never really gone, he said. I was just waiting for you to understand that. Outside, the oak trees were pressing closer to the bus, and Beth could feel the ancient hunger stirring in their roots. But she could also feel something else, the collective will of dozens of children who'd been trapped too long, who were finally ready to choose their own ending. Together? She asked. Together, Eli agreed. Beth stood up and faced the shadow that lived in the grove, the thing that had been feeding on loss and memory and the desperate love of families for 2 centuries. We're not your food anymore, she said. And we're not your servants. We're just children who want to go home. She opened the bundle of clothes and let them fall like autumn leaves throughout the bus. Each piece found its way to the child who'd worn it, and as the fabric touched their skin, they began to remember who they'd been before they'd been taken. The bus started to dissolve around them, its impossible existence finally ending. The oak grove began to wither, its ancient hunger finally starving. And one by one, the children began to fade, not into death, but into whatever place children go when they're finally ready to let go of the world that wouldn't let them go. Eli was the last to fade, his hand still touching Beth's face. "Thank you for waiting," he said. "But you don't have to wait anymore." And then he was gone, and Beth was alone in an empty clearing behind Bouchard's farm, holding nothing but a handful of old clothes and the memory of a choice that had taken 33 years to make. She walked back through the corn maze as the October sun broke through the morning mist, and found Donna waiting for her at the edge of the field. "Did it work?" Donna asked. Beth looked back at the clearing, where the ancient oaks were nothing but stumps now, their power finally broken. "Ask me again next October 12th, she said. "If no children go missing, we'll know." They walked back to the corner of Maple and Pine, where the others were still waiting. Frank Duloc was smiling for the first time in 33 years. His contradictory memories finally resolved into a single, peaceful truth. Tommy and Janet were standing together, no longer carrying the weight of impossible secrets. And George Bouchard was burning the Scarecrow from his corn maze, watching the blue windbreaker jacket turn to ash in the morning light. "It's over," he said as they approached. "I can feel it. The thing that's been in these woods since my family first settled here. It's finally gone." Beth stood at the corner where she'd spent so many mornings waiting for a bus that shouldn't exist, and for the first time in 33 years, she didn't know what to do with herself. "What now?" she asked. Donna smiled and pulled out her notebook. "Now you tell me the whole story, and I write it down so people will remember what really happened here. You think anyone will believe it? Does it matter? The children are free. The cycle is broken. Sometimes the truth isn't about being believed. It's about being witnessed." Beth nodded and took one last look at the empty corner where she'd said goodbye to her brother every October 12th for 33 years. Tomorrow was October 13th, the first day of the rest of her life. For the first time since she was 3 years old, she didn't know what that life would look like. And for the first time in 33 years, she was okay with that.